The spark of genius, Benjamin Franklin's revolutionary mind. The storm clouds gathering over Philadelphia in the summer of 1752 mirrored the dark tempest brewing between Britain and her colonies. But Benjamin Franklin's mind was focused on a different kind of revolution. Standing in a field, his grey hair wild in the wind, the 46-year-old printer held a simple kite aloft and prepared to steal fire from the gods. What sort of man flies a kite in a thunderstorm? The same one who would help birth a nation through the force of his pen, charm the court of France with homespun wisdom, and create an American archetype that endures to this day. A prophet of progress who carried no religious doctrine. A humble tradesman who dined with kings. A scientist who wrote drinking songs, a diplomat who told dirty jokes, a ladies' man who became the world's most famous grandfather. To his enemies, and he collected more than a few, Franklin was an uncouth colonial upstart, a dangerous radical masquerading as a simple American. To his admirers, he represented humanity's highest potential, proof that wit, determination, and endless curiosity could raise a man from obscurity to the pantheon of history. Both sides understood, even if they wouldn't admit it, that they were witnessing something unprecedented, the creation of the first true American. This is not just the story of how a candlemaker's son illuminated the world with his discoveries, though lightning rods would crown buildings across Europe thanks to his experiments. It's not merely a tale of how a runaway apprentice became the most famous American in the world, though kings would compete for the pleasure of his company. It's an account of how one man's restless mind helped forge the American character itself, pragmatic yet idealistic, innovative yet traditional, witty yet profound. When that kite string began to spark with electricity, Franklin didn't just prove that lightning was a form of electrical charge. He demonstrated something far more revolutionary, that the natural world could be understood, tamed, and harnessed by anyone brave or curious enough to question established wisdom. It was a quintessentially American idea from a man who, more than any other founder, showed us who we were and who we might become. This is his story. A rebel's journey, young Benjamin Franklin in Boston. On a bitter January morning in 1706, in a modest house just steps from Boston's Old North Church, Josiah Franklin's wife, Abiah, brought forth their 8th child, and his 15th overall. The infant, named Benjamin after his uncle, arrived in a city gripped by paradox, a Puritan stronghold that doubled as New England's busiest port, where strict religious doctrine collided daily with the temptations of maritime commerce and forbidden ideas. Young Ben would embody these contradictions. In a society that prized conformity, he developed an almost pathological inability to accept authority without question. Where others saw divine mysteries, he perceived puzzles waiting to be solved. And in a family that could barely afford books, he would somehow build one of the finest minds of his century. The boy's earliest memories were steeped in tallow and soap. Josiah's chandlery shop filled their home with the perpetual reek of rendered fat, a smell that would forever remind Benjamin of childhood poverty and of his father's endless labor. Watching Josiah carefully dip wicks into molten wax, young Ben absorbed his first lessons in patience and precision. But he wanted more than a craftsman's life. By age 8, he had already mastered a crucial skill, the art of charming adults into lending him books. Cotton Mather's essays, Plutarch's Lives *, Bunyan's, Pilgrim's Progress *. Young Franklin devoured them all by candlelight, often going without dinner to purchase the next volume. He developed a particular passion for Xenophon, whose accounts of Socrates taught him the power of asking innocent questions that exposed the foolishness of the powerful. "I was rather lucky in my disputes," he would later write with characteristic understatement. In truth, he was devastating. Other children played at soldiers. Ben played at Socrates, developing a method of argument that would later bedevil the British Parliament. He learned to lead opponents into logical traps, all while maintaining an air of humble inquiry that made it impossible to take offense without appearing churlish. His father, hoping to channel this sharp mind toward God's service, initially steered him toward the ministry. But after watching Ben systematically dismantle several expensive theological texts through pure logic, Josiah wisely decided that printing might be a safer profession for such a dangerously inquisitive son. Enter James Franklin, Ben's older brother and reluctant master. In 1718, 12-year-old Benjamin signed indentures to serve as James's apprentice until age 21. The arrangement proved simultaneously fortunate and disastrous. James was a skilled printer but a brutal master, prone to both verbal and physical abuse. Yet he also inadvertently gave Ben the tools for his escape: access to more books than any other shop in Boston, the craft of writing, and, most dangerously, a first-hand view of how power corrupts. The breaking point came with the launch of James's New England Courant in 1721. It was Boston's first independent newspaper, and its irreverent tone scandalized the city's establishment. When James was jailed for mocking the government, 16-year-old Ben took over as editor. The experience intoxicated him. But it wasn't enough to merely print the paper, he wanted to write for it. Thus was born Silence Dogood, a middle-aged widow whose witty letters to the Courant delighted Boston's readers. For months, James proudly printed these anonymous submissions, unaware that their author was the apprentice he regularly beat. When he discovered the deception, his fury confirmed what Ben already suspected. It was time to leave Boston. One morning in 1723, 17-year-old Benjamin Franklin quietly boarded a sloop bound for New York. In his pocket were a few Dutch dollars and some spare clothes. In his mind was a vision of independence that would eventually reshape the world. Boston had given him his foundation literacy, skepticism, and a burning desire for self-determination. But to become Benjamin Franklin, he needed to escape its shadows. Behind him lay a city of rigid hierarchies and predetermined paths. Ahead lay only possibility. He had no way of knowing that this act of youthful rebellion would launch one of history's most remarkable careers. But he did know one thing: he was free. Philadelphia Rising, the transformation of Benjamin Franklin. Philadelphia in 1723 was everything Boston wasn't, a city without a past. While Boston's crooked streets followed ancient cowpaths, Philadelphia's grid stretched toward the horizon with mathematical precision, its right angles expressing William Penn's vision of rational order. Into this carefully planned paradise stumbled a 17-year-old runaway, his pockets empty save for a Dutch dollar and the crumbs from his last bread roll. Franklin's legendary entrance, bedraggled, hungry, munching on those famous 3 rolls while his future wife watched from her doorway, would later become American mythology. But the reality was more compelling than the myth. Within hours of arriving, this penniless teenager had already begun weaving the social web that would define his success. By nightfall, he had secured both lodging and the promise of work, having convinced Philadelphia's leading printer that Boston's loss could be Pennsylvania's gain. The city's relative freedom intoxicated him. Here, a man's origins mattered less than his abilities. Here, the rigid hierarchies of Puritan Boston gave way to a more fluid society, where wit and industry could redraw social boundaries. Franklin set about testing those boundaries immediately, deploying his characteristic blend of charm and calculated self-presentation. His first triumph came through failure. Dispatched to London by Pennsylvania's governor on false promises, Franklin found himself stranded in Britain without connections or credentials. Lesser men would have crumbled. Franklin turned the setback into opportunity, mastering the printer's trade in London's finest shops while building a network that would later prove invaluable to American interests. When he returned to Philadelphia in 1726, he brought back more than improved technical skills. He had learned how the empire's power brokers thought. The Franklin who stepped off that return ship was a new creation, confident, sophisticated, and ruthlessly focused on independence. Within 2 years, he had established his own printing house. Within 5, he owned Pennsylvania's most influential newspaper. The *Pennsylvania Gazette* under Franklin became more than just a source of news. It was a platform for reinventing American discourse. Through its pages, Franklin pioneered a distinctly American literary voice. Plain-spoken yet clever, moral without being preachy, serious about ideas, but never about itself. But Franklin's true genius lay in creating synergies between his ventures. His newspaper promoted his printing house. His printing house published his Poor Richard's Almanac *, which promoted his public persona. And that persona, the self-made sage of Philadelphia, attracted ambitious young men to his new philosophical society, which in turn generated content for his publications. Each success fed into the others, creating a virtuous cycle of rising influence. Poor Richard himself deserves special attention. Through this character, Franklin didn't just dispense wisdom, he invented a new American archetype. Poor Richard combined Protestant virtue with streetwise pragmatism, scholarly knowledge with common sense. When he wrote "Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise," he wasn't just creating a memorable phrase. He was codifying an emerging American worldview that saw no contradiction between spiritual and material success. Behind the scenes, Franklin was conducting another kind of experiment, testing whether virtue itself could be reduced to a science. His famous 13 Virtues project, begun in 1726, approached moral improvement with an engineer's precision. Each week focused on a different virtue, with progress tracked in a small notebook. That he often failed to meet his own standards bothered him less than the data these failures provided. Even his flaws became fuel for understanding. By 1748, Franklin had achieved what few could have imagined possible for a runaway apprentice. His printing empire stretched across the colonies. His writings were reprinted throughout the British Empire. His newspaper shaped public opinion, his almanac shaped popular culture, and his philosophical society shaped intellectual discourse. At 42, he was wealthy enough to retire from active business. But for Franklin, wealth was never the ultimate goal. As he withdrew from printing, he was already turning his restless mind toward new horizons. Electricity beckoned. Politics loomed. Europe waited. Philadelphia had given him his stage, but the performance was just beginning. In his pocket diary for 1748, Franklin sketched a simple drawing, a kite trailing a key on a silk string. Below it, he wrote a single word: experiment. The note marked more than just a scientific hypothesis. It was a declaration that America's first self-made man was ready to remake the world itself. The electrical revolution of Benjamin Franklin. The mysterious fluid called electricity was, in 1748, little more than a parlor trick. European nobles delighted in seeing sparks fly from Leyden jars, watching silk ribbons dance with static charge, and giving each other harmless shocks at parties. But in Franklin's hands, these drawing room amusements would revolutionize humanity's understanding of the natural world. Unlike his European counterparts, Franklin approached electricity with a tradesman's practicality and a journalist's gift for clear explanation. Where others saw magic, he saw mechanics. While nobles played with sparks, Franklin methodically tracked the flow of electrical fire through different materials, developing the revolutionary concept of positive and negative charge. His letters to London's Royal Society stripped away the field's mystical terminology, replacing it with the simple, precise language we still use today: battery, conductor, charge, positive, negative. The experiments themselves were dangerous enough to terrify modern safety inspectors. Franklin routinely risked electrocution in his makeshift laboratory, once nearly killing himself when a charge threw him across the room. He developed a peculiar party trick of electrifying the rim of a wine glass and challenging guests to shock themselves by taking a sip. "The electric fire," he wrote with characteristic understatement, "is not diminished by moistening one's lips beforehand." But it was the Kite experiment that transformed him from respected investigator to international celebrity. The precise date remains disputed, but sometime in 1752, Franklin and his son William ventured out in a storm with a silk kite, a hemp string, and a house key. The story of Franklin heroically drawing lightning from the sky would inspire generations. The reality was far more nuanced and more impressive. Franklin had already theorized that lightning was electrical. The kite merely proved what his mind had already deduced. News of the experiment electrified Europe. The French king ordered a special demonstration, during which a bolt of lightning killed the unfortunate scientist who had replaced Franklin's simple kite with a 40-foot iron rod. "What is the use of a newborn baby?" Franklin had famously replied when asked about electricity's practical applications. The answer came in his invention of the lightning rod, which soon crowned buildings across Europe and America. Yet Franklin's scientific fame rested on more than dramatic demonstrations. His methodical investigations produced insights that wouldn't be fully appreciated for centuries. He discovered the principle of conservation of charge. He identified the role of pointed conductors in drawing off electrical fire. He even conducted the first investigations into the relationship between electricity and magnetism, though this connection wouldn't be fully understood until Faraday's time. More revolutionary than any single discovery was Franklin's approach to investigation. He combined rigorous experimentation with accessible writing, creating a new model of what a scientist could be. His letters about electricity, collected and published in 1751, read more like adventure stories than academic papers. They made science exciting, comprehensible, and most radically democratic. Anyone with curiosity and careful observation could participate in unveiling nature's secrets. The scientific world responded with unprecedented acclaim. The Royal Society awarded him the Copley Medal, its highest honor. Universities across Europe granted him honorary degrees. The Russian Academy of Sciences made him a member. Even France's King Louis XV, not normally an admirer of colonial tradesmen, ordered Franklin's books translated. By 1757, Franklin had achieved something unprecedented. He had become famous not for wealth or birth or military glory, but for expanding human knowledge. His reputation would prove crucial in the diplomatic challenges ahead. When he sailed for London that year as Pennsylvania's agent, he arrived not as a mere colonial representative, but as Europe's leading electrical philosopher. Yet even at the height of his scientific fame, Franklin remained pragmatic. Asked why he had never pursued a theory to explain the nature of electricity itself, he replied that he was too busy investigating its effects. "What we know is already sufficient," he wrote. "What we do not know is infinite." In his final electrical experiments before politics consumed his attention, Franklin investigated the strange case of a bell that rang itself during thunderstorms. The investigation led him to discover atmospheric electricity, and to note that even on clear days, the air carried an electrical charge. It was a fitting metaphor for the political atmosphere he would soon navigate, charged with invisible tensions, waiting for a spark. Chapter 4. The Imperial Agent, 1757 to 1775. London in 1757 still wore the swagger of invincibility. The 7 Years' War raged across continents, but Britain's capital remained a colossus, drawing wealth and talent from an empire on which the sun never set. Into this maelstrom of power stepped America's most famous scientist, now transformed into Pennsylvania's diplomatic agent. Franklin arrived armed with nothing but wit, charm, and a chess player's grasp of strategy. He found lodgings at 36 Craven Street, a modest address that would soon become one of London's most influential salons. From this base, Franklin orchestrated a remarkable campaign of influence. By day, he navigated the labyrinthine corridors of Westminster. By night, he entertained a rotating cast of scientists, philosophers, and power brokers. His landlady's daughter, Polly Stevenson, became both surrogate child and intellectual companion, their letters forming one of the era's great philosophical correspondences. The political challenges seemed insurmountable. Pennsylvania's Penn family wielded enormous influence at court, blocking Franklin's efforts to tax their vast holdings. Colonial assemblies and royal governors locked in endless power struggles. Yet Franklin thrived in this environment, turning obstacles into opportunities. When Parliament debated the Stamp Act in 1765, he orchestrated a masterful campaign of resistance through seemingly innocent questions, leading British lawmakers to expose their own ignorance of colonial realities. His testimony before Parliament in 1766 became legendary. For hours, he parried loaded questions with disarming wisdom, dismantling British arguments while maintaining an air of humble loyalty. "The sun and death," he had once written, "cannot be looked at steadily." He might have added empire to that list. Franklin alone seemed able to stare directly at the contradictions of colonial rule, seeing both its necessity and its inevitable dissolution. Yet even as he served as colonial agent, Franklin harbored dreams of greater imperial unity. He proposed schemes for American representation in Parliament, believing until the last possible moment that reason could preserve the bonds between Britain and her colonies. In private letters, he sketched visions of a globe-spanning British Commonwealth, united by trade and enlightened self-interest. The dream began to crumble in 1772 with the Hutchinson Affair. As agent for Massachusetts, Franklin obtained private letters from Governor Thomas Hutchinson, revealing his support for an abridgment of what are called English liberties in the colonies. Franklin's decision to send these letters to Boston ignited a firestorm. Summoned before the Privy Council in January 1774, he endured an hour of public humiliation from Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn, who branded him a thief and a traitor. The scene in the cockpit, a room that had witnessed centuries of political drama, marked a turning point. Franklin stood silent throughout Wedderburn's assault, dressed in a spotted velvet suit that became famous in political cartoons. Those who knew him saw something change that day. The man who had devoted decades to bridging the Atlantic Divide now understood its inevitability. Without announcing his intentions, Franklin began methodically preparing for crisis. He maintained his social rounds while quietly gathering intelligence about British military preparations. He cultivated contacts in the French embassy, sensing that America would soon need European allies. Most crucially, he started sending his private papers home in small batches, ensuring that a lifetime's worth of scientific and political work wouldn't be seized when the break came. The final act played out in March 1775. Lord North's government, having learned of Franklin's clandestine activities, prepared to arrest him for treason. Tipped off by William Strahan, his closest British friend, Franklin booked passage on a Pennsylvania packet ship. He left behind 30 years of London life, his books, his electrical instruments, and any illusion that the empire could be reformed from within. The crossing took 6 weeks. From the deck, Franklin watched the Atlantic sunset, perhaps reflecting that he had crossed this ocean first as a young printer seeking typographical knowledge, then as a colonial agent seeking political wisdom, and now as something entirely new, an American. By the time he reached Philadelphia in May 1775, the first shots had already been fired at Lexington and Concord. He found a different America than the one he had left. The Continental Congress was in session. Militias drilled in town squares. His beloved Philadelphia hummed with revolutionary fervor. But the greatest revolution had occurred in Franklin himself. The imperial agent who had worked so tirelessly to preserve the British Empire was gone. In his place stood a leader ready to forge a new nation, Benjamin Franklin, the revolutionary diplomat. The Continental Congress of 1775 contained no shortage of fiery orators and passionate patriots. But when Benjamin Franklin rose to speak, the chamber fell silent. At 70, he had lived 3 lifetimes: printer, scientist, diplomat. Now he would help birth a nation, though the effort might kill him. His return from London had transformed him from conciliator to revolutionary. Within days of arriving in Philadelphia, he threw himself into the machinery of rebellion. The same methodical mind that had mapped electrical currents now tracked gunpowder supplies and militia movements. The network of postal routes he had built as Postmaster General became an intelligence system, carrying coded messages between patriot leaders. Congress dispatched him on a futile mission to Montreal in early 1776, hoping his fame might convince Quebec to join the revolution. The journey nearly killed him, 1,200 miles by carriage and sled through winter storms. He returned unsuccessful, but with a deeper conviction. America would need more than persuasion to win independence. It would need European allies. When Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence arrived at Franklin's desk, the old printer made only a few editorial changes. But one was telling. Where Jefferson had written, "We hold these truths to be sacred," Franklin substituted "self-evident." It was classic Franklin, replacing mystical authority with rational observation. The scientist who had demystified lightning now helped demystify the divine right of kings. The Declaration's signing placed a price on every participant's head. "We must all hang together," Franklin quipped, "or assuredly we shall all hang separately." But while others faced the gallows, Congress had a different fate in mind for him. In September 1776, at an age when most men contemplated retirement, Franklin embarked on history's most crucial fundraising mission. The voyage to France was a gauntlet of British cruisers. Franklin spent weeks confined below decks, using the time to conduct experiments on seawater temperatures, research that would later help chart the Gulf Stream. He arrived in Paris looking less like Europe's most famous American than a frontier philosopher. Fur cap, thick glasses, no wig. It was a calculated costume. The French expected a rustic sage, and Franklin gave them one. Paris embraced him with an enthusiasm that bordered on mania. His portrait appeared on snuff boxes and rings. Women adopted coiffures à la Franklin. "No one has ever snatched more success from snares laid for him by fortune," wrote one French observer. In truth, the snares were often of Franklin's own devising. Each carefully cultivated eccentricity, the fur cap, the homespun wisdom, the flirtations with French noblewomen served diplomatic ends. Behind the performance lay exhausting work. Franklin ran a sophisticated propaganda operation, planted stories in European newspapers, coordinated with American privateers, and negotiated endless loans and military supplies. When not charming nobles at Versailles, he managed a network of spies that stretched from London to Berlin. He even found time to conduct scientific experiments, though these often doubled as diplomatic theater. His demonstrations of electricity drew influential audiences. The arrival of John Adams as co-commissioner threatened to upset Franklin's careful diplomatic ballet. Adams, brilliant but charmless, chafed at Franklin's methods. "Franklin's whole life has been one continued insult to good manners," he complained. But while Adams fumed, Franklin's approach brought results. In 1778, France signed the Treaty of Alliance, transforming America's revolution into a global war. The strain nearly broke him. Gout and kidney stones confined him to bed for months at a time. He worked anyway, receiving diplomats and coded messages in his bedroom. When the British sent secret peace feelers in 1780, suggesting America abandon its French allies, Franklin's response was characteristically subtle. He leaked the proposal to the French government, cementing their commitment to the American cause. By 1781, as news of Yorktown reached Paris, Franklin could finally glimpse victory. The peace negotiations that followed tested all his diplomatic skills. He balanced French demands, British concessions, and his fellow commissioners' competing agendas with the delicacy of a chess master. The final treaty secured not just American independence, but also vast territorial concessions that would shape the future republic. When Franklin left France in 1785, he had accomplished the impossible. America had not only won independence, but emerged with powerful allies and advantageous trading relationships. Asked how he had achieved so much, he borrowed an image from his electrical experiments. "While the thunder of British power roared, we provided a conducting rod to carry it safely to ground." But his greatest diplomatic triumph lay in transforming America's image abroad. Through his own carefully crafted persona, he had shown Europe that something new had emerged across the Atlantic, a nation that valued merit above birth, practical wisdom above ancient privilege. In doing so, he had not just helped create a new country, he had helped create a new kind of country. Benjamin Franklin's final years, shaping a new nation. Philadelphia in 1785 barely resembled the city Franklin had left 9 years earlier. The revolution had transformed his carefully ordered streets into a maze of competing interests and bitter factions. Even his own house had changed. His daughter Sally had added a third story while he was in France, to have more room to entertain. Franklin, viewing the addition, merely smiled. "I would have had more judgment," he wrote, "had she raised it from the ground." At 79, racked by gout and kidney stones, Franklin might have been forgiven for retiring to his library. Instead, he plunged into the chaotic politics of the new republic. Pennsylvania elected him president, governor, almost immediately, a role he used to push for public education and abolition. But larger problems loomed. The Articles of Confederation were failing. States battled over trade and borders. Paper money sparked riots. The revolution had won independence, but liberty without unity promised only chaos. When delegates gathered for the Constitutional Convention in May 1787, Franklin was the eldest by nearly a decade. He arrived each day in a sedan chair carried by convicts from the local jail, a spectacle that amused Philadelphians but underscored the gravity of the proceedings. This was his last chance to shape the nation he had helped create. The convention nearly collapsed several times that sweltering summer. Franklin's greatest contribution wasn't any specific proposal, but his gift for easing tensions. When delegates reached an impasse, he would invite key opponents to dinner, plying them with Madeira wine and subtle persuasion. His home became neutral ground where compromises could be explored away from the formal sessions. His most crucial intervention came at the darkest moment. After 6 weeks of deadlock over state representation, tempers were explosive. Franklin rose, his hands trembling with age as he handed his speech to a colleague to read. He began with characteristic humor. "I have lived a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men." Then came the masterstroke. Instead of arguing for any position, he called for daily prayers at the convention. The suggestion was never adopted, but it changed the atmosphere. By reminding delegates of their higher purpose, Franklin had subtly shamed them into cooperation. The Great Compromise between large and small states followed shortly after. When critics later argued that the Constitution's complex system of checks and balances would never work, Franklin offered what became its most enduring defense. "I agree to this Constitution, with all its faults, if they are such. I doubt too whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution." But the Constitution was not his final battle. In his last years, Franklin took up his most controversial cause, the abolition of slavery. As president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, he crafted a brilliantly subversive petition to the First Congress. Instead of directly attacking slavery, he asked Congress to use its constitutional powers to promote human liberty to the full extent of their power. When Southerners protested, he published a satirical defense of slavery, allegedly written by an Algerian prince justifying the enslavement of Christians. The parallel was devastating. His final months were both painful and productive. Despite constant agony from bladder stones, he continued writing. His last published work was a satirical letter comparing anti-abolitionists' arguments to those of a fictional Sidi Mehmet Ibrahim defending the enslavement of Christians. Even on his deathbed, his wit remained sharp. When his daughter suggested he might recover by lying on his side, the stone might shift to a less painful position, Franklin whispered, "A dying man can do nothing easy." He died on April 17, 1790. 20,000 people attended his funeral, the largest such gathering in the young nation's history. The French National Assembly declared a period of mourning. Even his old adversaries in London's Parliament rose to honor him. Franklin's passing marked more than the death of a founder. It signaled the end of an era, the age when one person could master all fields of human knowledge. He had been the last true Renaissance man, equally at home discussing electricity with scientists, diplomacy with kings, or printing techniques with apprentices. In his will, Franklin left relatively modest bequests to family and friends. But to the cities of Boston and Philadelphia, he left an ingenious legacy: trust funds that would accumulate interest for 200 years, funding public works long after his death. It was his final experiment, an attempt to project his influence across centuries. He composed his own epitaph decades before his death: "The Body of B." Franklin Printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author. The delegates who crafted a new nation that summer in Philadelphia chose not to use it. Instead, his gravestone reads simply, "Benjamin and Deborah Franklin." It was perhaps the only time in his life that Franklin settled for understatement.